The crystal chandelier above my brother's dining table cost more than my first car. I knew this because Tony had mentioned it 14 times since I'd arrived. Once for every year I'd apparently been figuring things out while he'd been building something real. The light fractured through cut glass, casting tiny rainbows across the bone china, each one a small, expensive reminder that I was sitting in a world that had decided I didn't belong in it. I was 42 years old, and my family had spent the last 2 decades constructing an elaborate fiction about my failure. It started small. It always does. When I was 23 and told them I'd enlisted in the Air Force, my mother, Constance Langley, Junior League president and arbiter of all things proper, went pale. Not the kind of pale that suggests shock or concern. The kind that suggests profound social embarrassment, like I'd announced I was joining the circus. "The military?" she'd said, as if I'd uttered an obscenity. "Demi, darling, that's what people do when they don't have options." My father, Gerald, had been more direct. "It's a phase. She'll come back when she realizes she can't hack it." That was 1999. I never came back. Well, not in the way they meant. The problem wasn't that I'd joined the military. The problem was that I'd refused to perform my failure for them. I didn't call home crying about basic training. I didn't quit after a year and slink back to Connecticut with my tail between my legs, ready to accept whatever entry-level position my father could secure through his network. I just disappeared into a career they couldn't see and therefore couldn't respect. "What exactly do you do?" my sister-in-law, Bria, had asked me once, 3 Thanksgivings ago. She'd said it the way you might ask someone what kind of fungus they were growing in their basement. Curious, but mostly horrified. "I work in operations," I'd said. "Operations." She'd repeated the word slowly, as if testing it for hidden meaning. "Like a factory?" Something like that. The truth was classified. The clearance level required to know what I actually did was so high that even explaining why I couldn't explain would have violated protocol. So I'd learned to smile, to deflect, to let them construct whatever narrative made them comfortable. They'd decided I was some kind of low-level administrative assistant on a military base, a glorified secretary in fatigues. It was the only explanation that made sense to them. How else could someone spend 20 years in the Air Force without ever talking about promotions, without ever name-dropping impressive assignments, without ever leveraging her career into something that mattered at their dinner parties? My brother Tony had made his assumptions clear over the years. He'd graduated from Wharton, done a stint at Goldman Sachs, and now ran strategic partnerships at some tech firm that burned through venture capital like kindling. His business cards were heavy cardstock with raised lettering. His cufflinks cost $400. His entire identity was built on the visible accumulation of markers that screamed success to anyone within eyeline. And I was his embarrassment. "She's very independent," he'd explained to colleagues when forced to acknowledge my existence. The word independent doing heavy lifting. A polite euphemism for unemployable, or difficult, or couldn't make it in the real world. I'd watched this dynamic calcify over 20 years. Watched it at my father's 60th birthday, where I'd been seated at the kids' table, despite being 37. While Tony held court with the adults. Watched it at my cousin's wedding, where my mother introduced me to her friends as taking some time to find herself, as if I were a wayward college student backpacking through Europe, not a woman with 2 decades of service. Watched it at every Christmas, every Easter, every obligatory family gathering where I was the curiosity, the cautionary tale, the one who'd chosen wrong. The mockery wasn't loud. That would have been easier to confront. It was in the gentle corrections, the concerned looks, the way my mother would pull me aside and ask, voice dripping with maternal worry, if I was doing okay financially, if I needed anything, if I'd thought about going back to school. "I'm fine, Mom." Quote, "It's just that you're not getting any younger, and these jobs, these enlisted positions, they don't have the same retirement benefits as a real career." "I'm aware. I'm just saying, your father knows people, you could still do something with your life." Do something with your life. As if I hadn't spent the last 20 years doing exactly that. As if I hadn't briefed members of Congress. As if my signature hadn't authorized operations that would never make the news, but had quietly reshaped geopolitical realities. As if I hadn't sat in rooms with four-star generals and foreign ministers and people whose names the average American would recognize instantly. But I couldn't tell them any of that, and so their fantasy persisted, growing more elaborate with each passing year, fed by my silence. The most absurd part? I'd learned to find it almost funny. Not in a bitter way, in a genuinely surreal, darkly comic way. There was something perversely entertaining about sitting through my mother's lectures on building a professional network while I mentally cataloged the last secure facility I'd visited. Something amusing about nodding along while my father explained how the real world works to a woman who'd spent the previous week coordinating with NATO allies on classified satellite imagery protocols. I developed a certain sardonic detachment from it all, a running internal commentary that kept me sane. Like 3 months ago, at my niece's graduation party, when my brother's colleague, some venture capitalist named Randall with too much hair gel, had cornered me by the dessert table. "So Tony tells me you're in the service," he'd said, loading the word with significance as if he were acknowledging something vaguely shameful. "That's really admirable. My gardener's son did that, helped him straighten out his life." "Did it?" I'd said, loading a second piece of cake onto my plate. "Oh, absolutely. He's managing a car wash now, doing really well." "The dream," I'd said flatly. He'd missed the sarcasm entirely. "Exactly. It's all about finding your level, you know? Not everyone can be in the boardroom." He'd clapped me on the shoulder, a gesture of such condescending solidarity that I'd briefly fantasized about the 15 different ways I could disarm and restrain him using only the dessert fork in my hand. But I'd just smiled, eaten my cake, let him return to the adults feeling good about his charitable acknowledgement of my little life. The thing about being consistently underestimated is that it becomes a kind of superpower. People don't guard their words around you. They don't see you as a threat. They tell you things about themselves, about their assumptions, about the scaffolding of their own insecurities that they'd never reveal to someone they respected. I'd learned that in interrogation training, actually. The power of appearing non-threatening, the intelligence value of being dismissed. My family had been giving me free masterclasses for 2 decades. And tonight was shaping up to be another session. Tony's company was hosting some kind of industry gala at the Metropolitan Club in Manhattan. Strategic Partners Gathering, he'd called it, which I'd learned meant excuse to drink expensive alcohol and compare net worths. He'd invited me exactly once in an email that had managed to feel both obligatory and reluctant. "Mom says I should include you. It's formal. Try to dress appropriately." I debated not coming. I had actual work to do, the kind that involved briefing documents marked TSCI and conference calls on encrypted lines. But my mother had phoned 3 times, employing her signature blend of guilt and concern. "It would mean so much to your brother. He's trying to include you, Demi. The least you can do is show up and be supportive." Supportive. So here I was, in a dress I'd bought specifically for events like this, expensive enough to meet the dress code, understated enough not to prompt questions about where I'd gotten the money. My hair pulled back in a simple knot. Minimal jewelry. The uniform of someone trying not to be noticed. I'd arrived at 7:30 p.m., fashionably late enough to avoid the reception line but early enough not to be rude. The Metropolitan Club was exactly what you'd expect. All marble columns and oil paintings of dead robber barons, the kind of place that charged you $500 just to breathe its rarefied air. Tony had spotted me almost immediately, his expression flickering through surprise that I'd actually come. Concern about what I was wearing, and resignation that he'd have to acknowledge me in rapid succession. "You made it," he'd said, voice carefully neutral. "I made it." "Well, good, great, Mom will be pleased." He'd glanced around, as if checking who might have seen him talking to me. "The firm's partners are here. Try to, not mention the military thing too much." Some of these guys are, traditional, conservative, old school. They have certain ideas about professional women, and the whole uniform thing kind of reinforces stereotypes about women in male-dominated fields. I'd offered helpfully. Makes things awkward, he'd finished. Just maybe talk about other stuff. Hobbies, travel, anything normal. Anything normal. I'd nodded, smiled, watched him relax slightly, believing I'd been managed successfully. The evening had proceeded exactly as expected. I'd been installed at a table near the back. Not quite hidden, but definitely not prominently displayed. The centerpiece was a tower of white roses that probably cost more than my monthly housing allowance. The other guests at my table were various corporate spouses and a few junior associates who'd drawn the short straw on seating assignments. I'd made small talk, commented on the venue, complimented someone's earrings, played the part of Tony's vaguely disappointing sister who was trying at least to fit in. And then they'd arrived at my table. Randall, the same venture capitalist from the graduation party, and his wife, Shayna. She was wearing what I estimated to be $15,000 worth of jewelry and an expression of aggressive friendliness that suggested she'd already had 3 glasses of champagne. "Demi," Randall had boomed, as if we were old friends. "Shayna, this is Tony's sister, the one I told you about." The one he'd told her about. Meaning, the one with the sad little military job, the one who'd never quite figured out how to be successful, the one who served as a useful reference point for their own achievements. Shayna had slid into the seat next to me, bringing with her a cloud of perfume and curiosity. "So nice to finally meet you," she'd said warmly. "Randall says you're in the Air Force?" "I am." That must be so interesting. The way she said interesting suggested she meant the opposite. "What do you do there exactly?" "Operations and logistics," I'd said, using my standard deflection. "Oh." She'd processed this, trying to map it onto something she understood. "So you help move things around, like supplies?" "Something like that." "That's so important," she'd said, with the emphatic sincerity of someone complimenting a janitor's work. "I mean, someone has to do it, right?" "Someone does," I'd agreed. Randall had jumped in, eager to demonstrate his worldliness. "I think it's great that the military is providing opportunities for women now. Even if they can't do everything the men do, there's definitely a place for them in support roles." I'd taken a long sip of water, counted to 3, reminded myself that assault charges were frowned upon at formal events. "How progressive," I'd said. "Exactly," he'd missed it again. "And I'm sure you've learned a lot. Discipline, time management, following orders. Those are transferable skills." "They are." "Have you thought about what you'll do after?" Shayna had asked. "I mean, you can't do that forever. Do they help you transition to civilian jobs?" "There are programs," I'd said vaguely. "You should talk to Tony," Randall had suggested. "I bet he could find you something. Admin work, maybe HR." Companies love hiring veterans for that kind of thing. Shows they're committed to social responsibility. Social responsibility. As if I were a charity case. A box to check on some corporate diversity initiative. I'd smiled. "That's very kind." The conversation had drifted after that, mercifully, to safer topics. Someone's recent vacation to Turks and Caicos. Someone else's child's acceptance to Princeton. The normal currency of this world. Money, status, access, all the visible markers of success that you could name drop at cocktail parties. I'd listened with half an ear, my mind elsewhere. Because what they didn't know, what they couldn't know, was that earlier that day, I'd been in a Pentagon briefing room. I'd spent 4 hours reviewing intelligence assessments on Chinese military capabilities in the South China Sea. I'd listened to a 2-star general defer to my analysis on satellite imagery interpretation. I'd signed off on recommendations that would go directly to the Secretary of Defense. And then I'd changed clothes, gotten on a train, and come here to be patronized by people who thought I moved boxes for a living. The surrealism of it never got old. Dinner was served. Some kind of duck preparation that came with microgreens and a foam made from something French and unpronounceable. I'd eaten worse, much worse, in forward operating bases where the closest thing to fine dining was hoarding the good MREs. The speeches started around 9 p.m. Tony's CEO, a man named Buchanan who radiated self-importance, held forth about synergistic partnerships and disrupting the enterprise solutions space. Everyone applauded at the appropriate moments. Someone made a toast to innovation that was really a toast to profit margins. I checked my phone under the table. 3 messages, all encrypted, all requiring my attention. One from my XO about a scheduling conflict for next week's meeting with Stratcom. One from the J2 shop requesting my input on an assessment brief. One from my aide reminding me that I had a call with the National Security Council staff at 7 a.m. tomorrow. I'd handled them quickly, thumbs flying over the secure messaging app, and slipped the phone back into my purse before anyone noticed. And that's when it happened. Shayna had been watching me, I realized. Watching me with that specific kind of female attention that suggests judgment is being rendered. "You know," she'd said, leaning in conspiratorially, "I think it's wonderful that you came tonight. It must be hard, being around Tawny's world, all his success." I'd looked at her, really looked at her, at the diamond tennis bracelet, the tastefully highlighted hair, the careful makeup designed to look effortless. At the entire architecture of wealth and status that she wore like armor. "It's not hard," I'd said. "Oh, I just mean, you two are so different. He's built this amazing career, and you've chosen such a different path. There's no shame in that." "No shame in that." "I don't feel any shame," I'd said evenly. "Of course not. I think it's actually really brave. Not everyone is cut out for the corporate world. Some people are better with their hands, doing practical things." Doing practical things. Like I was a particularly dedicated plumber. Randall had nodded enthusiastically. "Absolutely. The world needs ditch diggers too, right?" He'd laughed at his own joke, a reference to some movie I didn't care to identify. I'd opened my mouth to respond, with what, I wasn't sure, probably something cutting enough to end this conversation permanently, when Tony had appeared at our table. "How's everyone doing over here?" He'd had that false cheer in his voice, the kind that suggested he was concerned I was embarrassing him somehow. "Wonderful!" Shayna had gushed. "We're just getting to know your sister. She's fascinating." "Fascinating, the way you describe an exotic insect." "Great," Tony had said, clearly not believing this. His eyes had flicked to me, a warning, behave. "We were just talking about her work," Randall had added. I was telling her she should think about leveraging her military experience into something in the private sector, when she's ready to, move on. Tawny had looked uncomfortable. "Yeah, well, Demi's pretty committed to her thing. Her thing. Not her career, not her service, her thing. Like it was a hobby, a phase, something vaguely embarrassing that he had to tolerate because we shared DNA. Still," Shayna had pressed, "you must want more than that eventually. I mean, you're not getting any younger, and these military jobs, they don't exactly offer the same opportunities as the private sector. No offense." "None taken," I'd said, with a smile that didn't reach my eyes. "I just mean, look at Tony. He's built something real, a career that matters. That's going somewhere." She'd reached out and squeezed my hand, a gesture of such profound condescension that I'd briefly considered breaking her fingers. "It's not too late for you to do something similar. You just need to be willing to make different choices." Different choices. As if my choices had been wrong. As if the last 20 years of my life, years spent serving my country, years spent in classified briefings and secure facilities and situations these people couldn't begin to imagine, had been a waste. A detour from the real work of accumulating wealth and status. Tony had been watching this exchange with obvious discomfort, but he hadn't intervened, hadn't defended me. Hadn't said a single word to suggest that maybe, just maybe, his sister's career was worth respecting. And that's when Shayna had delivered the killing blow. She'd leaned back, surveying me with that peculiar expression of pity mixed with relief. relief that she wasn't me, that her life had turned out correctly, that she'd made the right choices. I mean, you're Tony's sister, so you must have had opportunities. You could have gone to business school. You could have done what he did. But you chose this. She gestured vaguely at me, encompassing my entire existence. And that's fine. That's your choice. But you have to understand why it's hard for people in Tony's position to explain. Why it's awkward. I'd felt something shift inside me, not anger. I was too practiced at controlling that, but a kind of cold clarity. A recognition that this wasn't just casual mockery anymore. This was judgment. This was a woman who genuinely believed she was superior to me, who believed my life was a failure, who believed she was doing me some kind of favor by pointing out the error of my ways. And I'd been about to respond. I'd had something particularly sharp loaded and ready when I'd heard footsteps approaching our table. The waiter had appeared at my elbow, young and professionally polite, carrying a bottle of champagne that I immediately recognized as absurdly expensive. Dom Perignon, probably 2008 or 2012, the kind of bottle that required a second mortgage to purchase. He'd set a glass in front of me, filled it with careful precision, and then said the words that would detonate the evening. "Compliments of the Treasury Secretary, ma'am." He says congratulations on the promotion. The table had gone silent. Not quiet, silent. The kind of silence that suggests the world has stopped rotating. I'd looked at the champagne, at the waiter's professional smile, at the sudden, complete stillness of everyone within earshot. Shauna had been frozen, her face locked in an expression of confusion. Randall had looked like someone had just explained quantum physics to him in ancient Sumerian. And Tony, my brother Tony, who'd spent 20 years managing my embarrassment, who'd seated me at the back table, who'd warned me not to mention the military, had gone absolutely white. "I'm sorry," Shayna had said slowly, as if the words themselves were difficult to process. "The Treasury Secretary?" The waiter had nodded, already backing away, his job done. "Yes, ma'am, he's at table 7. He asked me to convey his congratulations to Brigadier General Langley on her recent promotion to Major General." And there it was. 20 years of careful silence shattered. 20 years of deflection ended. 20 years of letting them construct their comfortable fiction about my failure, destroyed by a single sentence from a man I'd briefed twice in the last 6 months. Randall's jaw had literally dropped. Literally, his mouth had opened and stayed that way, words failing him completely. Shayna had blinked rapidly, her champagne-fueled confidence evaporating like morning dew. "Major? General?" 2 stars. I'd confirmed pleasantly, taking a sip of the champagne. It was excellent, as expected. Well, technically the promotion doesn't take effect until January, but yes. Tony hadn't said anything, hadn't said a single word. He'd just stared at me as if I'd suddenly materialized from another dimension. Which, in a sense, I had. Because the Demi they knew, the one who worked in operations, who did practical things, who was better with her hands, she didn't exist. She never had. She was a phantom they'd created, a projection of their own need to feel superior, to believe that their choices were the only valid ones. The real Demi, the one who'd graduated top of her class from the Air Force Academy, who'd spent 10 years in intelligence operations, who'd commanded at every level from flight to wing, who deployed to 6 different countries, who'd held a top-secret sensitive compartmented information clearance since she was 27, who'd been selected for flag rank at 41, making her one of the youngest generals in the Air Force. She'd been here all along. They just couldn't see her. "But you," Shayna had started, then stopped, started again. "You said you worked in logistics." I said operations and logistics. I'd corrected gently, which is technically accurate. I command operational forces. The logistics are just part of it. "Command," Randall had repeated weakly. "Approximately 4,000 personnel across multiple installations," I'd clarified, give or take, depending on deployment cycles. The silence had spread. Other tables had noticed the champagne delivery, the waiter's announcement, the sudden frozen tableau at our table. People were leaning in, whispering. And then, from across the room, I'd heard a chair scrape back. Secretary Winters was making his way toward our table. I'd briefed him last month on cybersecurity protocols for the financial sector. He was a serious man, former Wall Street executive turned public servant, and he didn't make social gestures lightly. "General Langley," he'd said, extending his hand. "I hope I'm not interrupting. I wanted to congratulate you personally before I left for the evening." I'd stood, shaken his hand. "Thank you, Mr. Secretary. That's very kind." "Not at all. Your work on the Joint Task Force has been exceptional. The President specifically mentioned it in our last cabinet meeting." The President. I'd seen Tony's face go from white to red to white again. Secretary Winters had nodded to the table politely, then returned to his party. But the damage, or rather, the revelation, was complete. Every eye in the room was now on our table, on me. The whispers had started immediately. "General? 2 stars? Did he say the President? That's Tony Langley's sister?" Shayna had been staring at me like I'd grown a second head. "Why didn't you say anything?" I'd taken another sip of champagne, let the question hang in the air for a moment. "You never asked," I'd said finally. "Not really. You asked what I did, and I told you. Operations. You just heard what you wanted to hear." "But," she'd looked desperately at Randall, at Tony, at anyone who might make this make sense. "But you let us think." "I let you think whatever made you comfortable," I'd said, keeping my voice even. Not angry, not triumphant, just factual. You decided what my life looked like based on your own assumptions. I just didn't correct you. Randall had found his voice, though it came out strangled. "You're a general, a 2-star general." "As of January, yes." "And before, what were you before?" 1-star general," I'd said. "Before that, full colonel. Before that, lieutenant colonel. It's a fairly standard progression." "Jesus Christ," Tony had whispered. I'd looked at my brother, really looked at him, at the expensive suit, the careful hair, the entire performance of success that he'd built his identity around. "You could have told me," he'd said finally, "all these years. You could have said something." "Could I have?" I'd asked quietly. "Would you have believed me? Or would you have assumed I was lying, making it up to compete with you?" He'd opened his mouth, closed it. He didn't have an answer because we both knew the truth. Shayna had stood abruptly, her chair scraping. I need the restroom." She'd fled. Randall had followed shortly after, mumbling something about checking on his wife. And then it was just me and Tony, sitting at a table scattered with half-eaten desserts and the ruins of his worldview. "Why didn't you tell us?" he'd asked again. "Mom and Dad? They don't know either, do they?" "No." "Why?" I'd considered the question. The real question. Not why I'd kept my rank classified, that was standard security protocol at certain levels, but why I'd let them all believe I was nothing, nobody, a failure. "Because you needed me to be," I'd said finally, "all of you, you needed someone to compare yourselves against, someone who'd made the wrong choices so you could feel better about your own. And it was easier to let you have that than to fight you on it every day for 20 years. That's not fair, isn't it?" I'd met his eyes. "When's the last time you asked about my work? Really asked? Wanting to know the answer? When's the last time any of you considered that maybe I had reasons for my choices? That maybe my life was exactly what I wanted it to be?" He'd looked away. "I love what I do, Tawny. I love serving. I love the work. I love the mission. I don't need a corner office or a 7-figure salary or a business card with raised lettering to feel like my life matters. I have 4,000 airmen whose safety and readiness depend on me. I brief members of Congress. I work with allies across 5 continents. I help protect our country from threats you don't even know exist." I'd paused. "And you all decided that because you couldn't understand it, it must not be worth doing." The truth of it had settled over the table like ash. "I'm sorry," he'd said finally. We should have." "Yes," I'd agreed. "You should have." Around us, the gala was continuing, but our corner of it had become its own separate reality. People were still watching, still whispering. The story was spreading. By tomorrow, everyone in Tony's professional circle would know. His embarrassing sister was actually a 2-star general. The failure was actually outranking most of the people in this room. I'd finished my champagne, set the glass down gently. "I should go," I'd said. "I have an early call tomorrow, National Security Council." Tony had just nodded, beyond words. I'd stood, collected my purse, and walked toward the exit. Heads turned as I passed. Whispers followed me like a wake. At the door, I'd glanced back. Tony was still sitting there, staring at nothing, his world quietly rearranging itself around this new, impossible truth. That his sister wasn't a failure. She never had been. She'd just been succeeding in a language he'd never learned to speak. The car service dropped me off at my apartment in Alexandria at 11:47 p.m. I texted my aide that I was home safe, protocol, and poured myself 2 fingers of bourbon. My phone buzzed. My mother. I let it go to voicemail. It buzzed again. A text from Tony. "We need to talk, really talk." I typed back, "Tomorrow, after my NSC call." Then I'd turned off my phone, changed into comfortable clothes, and sat on my couch in the dark, bourbon in hand, letting the evening replay in my mind. The look on Shayna's face, the strangled sound Randall had made, the secretary's casual mention of the president, and Tony's jaw literally hanging open as his entire understanding of reality restructured itself. I should have felt triumphant, vindicated. But mostly I just felt tired. 20 years of being small in their eyes so they could feel big. 20 years of swallowing my pride, my accomplishments, my truth, because it was easier than confronting their need to see me as less than. The bourbon burned going down, familiar and warming. Tomorrow, things would change. My mother would call, demand explanations, probably cry. My father would be confused, defensive, maybe even proud in his own bewildered way. Tony would want to process, to understand, to somehow integrate this new sister into his worldview. But tonight I was just Demi Langley, Major General, Select, sitting in her apartment, drinking good bourbon, and feeling the weight of 20 years of silence finally lift. My phone buzzed one more time before the ringer went silent. A text from a number I didn't recognize. "Saw what happened at the Met Club tonight. The Treasury Secretary's office is texting everyone. You're famous. Congratulations on the promotion. You earned it, Colonel Martinez." I smiled, set the phone down, finished my bourbon. Famous. After 20 years of invisibility, I was suddenly famous. The irony wasn't lost on me. But tomorrow I'd wake at 5:30 a.m., put on my uniform, and brief the National Security Council on critical intelligence assessments. I'd do my job, the job I'd been doing all along, regardless of whether my family could see it. The job that mattered. And if Shayna and Randall and all the other people at that gala had to recalibrate their understanding of success, if they had to confront the fact that worth isn't measured in stock options and Manhattan apartments, well, that was their problem to solve. Not mine. I'd spent 20 years solving bigger ones.